You're listening to the PT Pintcast, where smart people in healthcare come to make noise. Here's your host, Jimmy McKay.
All right, thanks, voice guy. Big thanks to Sarah Health, the remote care platform, helping clinics boost revenue without adding staff. Sarah automates daily patient check-ins via text. That means no app, no logins, just better outcomes. It's a simple way to meet RTM requirements, improve follow-through, and actually get you reimbursed for care between visits. Find them online at sarahealth.com. That's SARA health.com. Now imagine you're in a DeLorean, but instead of checking the time circuits, you're scanning tuition statements, burnout rates. The year on the dashboard, 2026, and the dashboard's flashing red. Something's wrong in the timeline of PT education. It's bloated, it's broken, and it's barreling towards a cliff. Or maybe we went over one already. So 3 longtime disruptors, part educators, part entrepreneurs, part Doc Brown with spreadsheets, grabbed the keys and hit 88 miles an hour. Together, they've founded programs, launched companies, taken on the APTA, and lived to tell about it. Now they're back, not just to warn the profession, but to rebuild it. This is Back to the Future, Part 1, the radical proposal to save physical therapy through a 5-year DPT redesign. Let's welcome in the show Tim Flynn, Larry Benz, John Childs. Gentlemen, how was my Back to the Future intro? Was it DeLorean worthy?
I would say it was Rivian worthy, but yes,
Rivian worthy. There you go. Now I got to tell you, I started this podcast by accident 10 years ago when I was still a student, and I remember a couple, and I think it was John, walked by, and you were having a conversation with someone, and I said, "Who's that?" And I remember someone saying, "Oh, no, you don't want to talk to that guy. He does crazy stuff." And I remember hearing about you guys, because I was still in school, and hearing about you guys over the years going, all the crazy stuff they're doing feels like it makes sense. Am I the crazy one? So let's start out with this. What year would you set the time machine back to? When did PT education go off the rails? If we were going to go back in time to sort of change it before it sort of forked, when was it okay? And then when did Biff Tannen show up and ruin everything?
Well, I'll just start off with a lighthearted comment. I should defer to my elders, Larry and Tim. They have more of the history than I do.
We live the history. In fact, we graduated pretty close together. Tim before me, so he should go first.
All right, Tim, when did we mess up?
Well, I started as a bachelor's, and actually with a bachelor's was teaching people like Larry who was getting a master's at Army Baylor. So I guess I am the oldest. So I think from my perspective, probably, and I think I was part of the problem, just when I look back at the time, but it was really when we went to the DPT, when you look at how that came about, the conversation around that time was such that none of the universities are going to buy this. You know, it's going to be such a heavy lift to really go from a master's degree, because in 90 it went to the master's to the doctorate. But what was fascinating, literally, you know, within about 5 years, everybody went there. And as you look back, you go, you sit around the university and the board of trustees, or even down below. So let me get this right. You want to go from 2 years to 3 years, and with the same number of faculty. So you basically, we get another years of tuition with really little cost. Yeah, we should do that. We should do that. So basically, all these universities went from 0 to 60, and all of a sudden we have 7 years of education. But I'll defer to my junior colleague, Dr. Benz here, because he really has the most detailed perspective, I think.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple surprises here. And when I talk about this, sometimes people look at me kind of strange, but let's rewind the clock to how the profession looked at it. And by the profession, I mean APTA and our national organization, because they led and carried the banner. And you also have to remember CAPT is to an extent intimately tied to them. So, when I was in graduate school, 1984, Tim, you were getting out, probably 1985. You got out, because I got out right at the beginning of 86. And so Tim is correct. He actually was one of our clinical instructors. While he had a bachelor's, I chose a master's program in 1984, in part because it was the Army Baylor program and it was subsidized, but also in part because it was one of the few master's programs that was available then. Again, think about that. 1984, there weren't many master's programs.
Right.
So what drove the master's degree? Was our profession. APTA said by 1990, and I think it was 1990, I'm going to be directionally correct here, all 108 programs at that time, whatever the number was, need to be at a master's level, whether they're both private or public. And obviously the privates exceed the publics because they have the flexibility and the autonomy to do so. Unfortunately, it wasn't until likely the last master's program probably hung around until the late 90s. We could look this up, but there were a few laggards. And lo and behold, by the time the last master's program actually complied with the regulations, by the way, OT tried to do this very unsuccessfully just a few years ago. It didn't work for them. They tried to do it to the DPT or to the OTD. But in any event, our profession said the body of knowledge is worthy of a master's degree. Not everybody complied on time. And even though the mandate was, let's say, 1990, it took another 10 years. Unfortunately, it only took a few years to convert from master's to DPT. And why was that? As Tim alluded to, it was driven by higher education. It was driven by the desire to get more bites of the apple and the tuition dollar from students. Didn't just affect PT, it affected almost everything. They call that academic creep. Accounting went through it by way of example. Pharmacy went through it. Speech and hearing went through it. OTD obviously did as well. Many others did. And so that's a really fundamental thing we have to remember. At some point then, the profession, Creighton, I believe, was the first program to go to a DPT level. And again, private schools exceeded. Many states had to pass things within the regulatory bodies of their state's own higher ed to get physical therapy to a doctorate education. But the main point being is that it transitioned. It didn't take, let's say, 15 years to go from bachelor's to master's. It was supposed to take 10. It only took about 5. It was like, It just absolutely exploded because the tuition went crazy. So much so that when I have lots of friends, and when I first started to employ PTs, we used to actually pay, there were still a lot of undergraduate programs when I was first in business, we used to actually pay scholarships for PTs to get their bachelor's degree and then come work for us. Obviously, by the time I got to a master's and certainly a DPT, who's going to be able to afford, 3 and 4 years of tuition dollars. One last point, I'll let John speak. We should not let higher education continue to dictate our profession, because our profession has migrated. We'll talk about COVID and the impact it's had on quality and types of education and hybrid and all that kind of stuff. But we have the control. We have the ability to retrade this and go back to the future if we want to. It will take some regulatory changes. It'll take some gnashing of the teeth. But it really is going to take our profession to go back to commanding control of itself like it did from the bachelor's to the master's.
Yeah, I think the primary comment I would have, and this is being as a critic to some extent of higher ed, I'm absolutely convinced if there was enough demand for a 10-year DPT program, higher ed would absolutely support it and move in that direction tomorrow. Now, that's a little bit facetious, but the reality is, to some extent, we are a victim of our own success. There is such demand for our services and a lack of therapists, that are out there, that there's this, motivation, obviously, to produce more and more therapists as needed. And the demand is so high, and the willingness and the willingness of the federal government to subsidize these loans, higher ed is just sitting on this heyday of extended academic creep, as Larry said. And again, that might be a little bit of an overly cynical view, but I think back to the time, when I was in PT school in the Army Baylor program, similar to Larry, it was a master's program. And at that time, most every program was a master's program, and most every program was 2 years in length. We were being sponsored by the Army or the Air Force in my case, who was incredibly interested in getting us out of school as soon as possible, right? The motivation is entirely different. They're paying us, salaries as lieutenants and captains to sit in a classroom and be relatively unproductive, right? We're not seeing patients. We're on a pathway to get a degree. So the motivation was acceleration. The motivation was full-time class, 8 to 5. The motivation was no summers off. And so the Army Baylor program, even when I was there, was 18 months. I mean, it was 6 months shorter than, the average quote unquote 2 years master. And so, I think even with the master's program, we saw academic creep because there were at least some models where the incentives were different, where the time from inception to, graduation was significantly shorter.
All right. So now we fast forward and we've got regulations that are coming into play. So that RISE rule, which everybody read, but they didn't read it. They read the abstract and panicked, or they read it and said, well, you guys are the guys who actually read and understand this stuff. The RISE rule could change everything. Are we about to see the federal government make DPT education impossible, or is this a good thing? Help me read these tea leaves here.
Let me comment on a couple things before we go there a bit, because there's some monumental inflection points in our profession. 2001, and the teaching point here is that we've never tried to control for supply, demand, or volume of PTs. And when the profession has tried to, they've been grossly wrong. So in 2001, at that time, there were about 10,000 new PTs per year, 10,000 in 2001, 5,000 American graduates of schools that would take their exam, and most of them, if not all of them, would practice clinically. At that time, there would be 10,000 foreign trained therapists that would come in the US. Half would pass the exam statistically, so another 5,000 would become employed in the US. Now, up until about a year or two ago, we're now graduating about 12,000, although not all 12,000 are practicing clinically. Not all of them are passing the exam. But we are literally now in 2026, roughly where we were at in 2001 in terms of the same numbers. That is when we should have made a decision on PT education, because we needed more PTs. Surprisingly, though, the academic community actually predicted that we were going to have this huge surplus. And that huge surplus, caused this pushback for developing not only programs, expanding programs or innovation. Those three things, when you halt program development, you halt innovation, and you halt the expansion of programs, you literally are trying to, restrict PTs in order to be able to get the number that we need. And now what we have is literally 70 to 80% of people who apply for a PT education somewhere are going to get accepted. We have seats that are open. Who would have ever predicted, in my monologue to this week's post, which will come out tomorrow or Wednesday, who would have ever predicted there'd be a time where anybody could become a PT? The qualifier is actually quite low. That has its own unintended consequences. So when we talk about RISE here, we need to also course correct the quality of students, coupled with those who are passionate and really want to become a PT, coupled with the ability to do it, the affordability and student loans, all those things. So we have to really kind of address all the challenges simultaneously, or we're going to keep pushing on one part of the sweater and another part's going to get a flaw in it.
2013, I sat in a room with 299 other applicants. They had narrowed it down for how many applications to 300 in-person interviews, 3 100-person sessions for 38 seats. And I remember doing the math when I walked in going, man, for every 10 people that walk in, I got to beat one of them. Well, sorry, I got to beat 9 of them. I got to be the one. And that gets a little intimidating. And now you hear some of the application rates falling through the floor, which is, again, shocking in that short time span. Again, that was 2013 for me, 2012. All right, so where do we go next? Do you want to fast forward to what's happening now, or is there still some context?
Well, I'll take briefly, the RISE question. It's obviously still out for comment. I
Sure.
think we're all, hopeful that PT is going to, get its due recognition as a, profession, so to speak. It's to some extent, I don't know if it's humorous and or sad, probably some of both.
Yeah.
You know, that many other disciplines, not to be named here, are considered professions when we're, when we're not. But if we go down the path of sort of this worst case scenario where all of a sudden, graduate loans are significantly curtailed, right, wrong, or indifferent, it will absolutely force innovation in PT education. We will overnight see programs getting shorter, faster, more innovative. I'm not saying that's necessarily the path I want to see us go down, but smaller, under-resourced programs that have big buildings and lots of fixed costs, they're all of a sudden, I mean, if you don't have, more than 50 to 60 students in your program, you're going to go away. You simply don't have enough revenues at that level to support the costs of running a program. And so I think what we'll see in that worst case scenario is the strong getting stronger. And boy, there'll be a third of DPT programs that will immediately start to struggle and or, at some point, disappear. Now, having said that, I've been predicting this, third of PT programs going away for 10 years, and it's just not happening at the pace at which I thought. So I'm guilty of, maybe early forecasting, but certainly a significant change, like we're talking about with some of the RISE regulations, would absolutely force that, those smaller under-resourced programs to rethink whether they want to be in the PT business.
Right. And you guys are going to go into detail with a series of articles, as I'll mention in the show notes. We'll give a link to that as well. So let's get to the solution. I mean, I think people are pretty familiar with at least some, if not all, the problems. So great. As my research professor in PT school said with a great Irish accent, we know what, now what, what, so what, now what. Break down that 5-year DPT proposal. Is this the hoverboard everybody's been waiting for? How does it look? What does it do to solve some of the problems we're currently in? Have at it.
Well, I'll speak to that and just say that really all of us here probably had many undergraduate courses that really didn't prepare us to excel in PT. And what I would mean by that are we're certain heavily on certain courses that just didn't translate. So, but just as we've accelerated the DPT from 3 to 2, at the bottom line, our entry into the PT world should be quicker. I mean, 3 years is a 3-year bachelor's degree, heavily focused on the skills of healthcare professionals, so that the skills really are, yes, a strong liberal arts background actually, but liberal arts that's applied to those skills that make you great at communicating with others. Those skills that actually translate across all the healthcare professions. So whether you go into a DPT or an OT program, a PA program, or to medicine, you essentially have the background of the people skills. And that 3-year bachelor's should include, skill credit for people that are working in the healthcare industry already, that are in people-focused business, or even people-focused business. I often say, I've always felt that bartenders and servers and waiters and waitresses are some of the best people to come into our profession, because you basically have to think on your feet, you have to look people in the eye, you have to communicate with people, and when shit goes wrong, you have to think on your feet and pivot and make things right. And those are, that to me are a skill set that people should have credit for, as you go into health care professions. So to me, there's heavily on the sciences that are focused to what we need in PT, and heavily on the humanities side of it, but also with practical skill sets that are people facing. And just one last comment, the thing that comes back always is, that's higher ed, it's they're not going to pivot. And like we said, people pivot immediately, like we did in COVID, when the situation requires it. But that's how I had probably started. I'll start on that kind of the entry point side.
Just a couple observations. One on rise, I'm going to predict that it's not going to end up being anything of significant. Even if it stays intact, it'll get kicked down the road many years before it actually gets implemented. Again, this is just my opinion, in part not because of PTs, but because of nurses. Nurses usually win. They have strong advocacy. The reality is healthcare shortages are not in dispute. And, putting forth an old reg on new student loan limitations doesn't make any sense for anybody. You think we have one of the lowest diversity percentages in PT, would only get worse under those scenarios of rise.
Sure.
So I think brighter minds will prevail. Having said that, regardless, we need more innovation in PT. The best example I'll go back to is nursing. You could get a nursing at an RN level, a BSN, a MSN, a doctorate in nurse practice now. And we have to have some tools to do that. So I do like the 3-year bachelor's into a 2-year DPT, but also like other flavors too. I like the idea of graduating into, baccalaureate for 4, even 2 years in a DPT. Okay, that's an additional year, but then you would get a master's and you get paid. The reason why you get your license and you get masters, that's critical because we have horrible regulations that basically say if you treat a Medicare patient that is in, life-threatening Part A, you can do so independently without supervision. But in Part B, you can't get billed or reimbursed unless you are consuming the same oxygen as a licensed PT standing next to you. And so that regulation, we're not going to change. We failed at every Medicare regulation change. We take shallow victories and things that don't matter, and things like direct access and things like the regulatory supervision requirements, 8-minute rule and student supervision. We're not going to win, in my opinion. And so let's play the game and say, let's give them a license 2 years or halfway through PT school. So that way their billing will count. They will not be as productive. They do not have to start as a full-time salary. Residents and interns don't get full-time salaries either in the medical model. And that could become a pathway when you complete that time frame of a year, whatever it is, then you can get your DPT. So my point being is, I think we have to develop a multitude of pathways, all of which uphold the rigor of academic and the competency and the knowledge base. But to Tim's point, what scares me the most is we will oftentimes default to too much technology, and then you're going to lose all tacit knowledge skills. You're going to lose collaboration, teamwork, and empathy and compassion. And the things that really, we're a victim of our success because we have the hands-on skills, we have the quantitative skills, but we also have the qualitative parts to our profession as well. And I'd hate to see that also be sacrificed for efficiency purposes.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add other than I do think nursing is a good example of, they have their own, issues with so many accreditors and some of those kinds of things, but they've certainly been innovative in having lots of different pathways to all sorts of variations of master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, doctoral degrees, to specifically equip you for the role that you're going to play in the nursing, ecosystem. And at least in PT at this point, we sort of have a one size fits all kind of an approach. I would say, I think the good news is we've got a lot of room to innovate. I mean, if you go back to the 4-year bachelor, there was a time where there was, I don't know if it was ever a third, but like you'd be working in the same clinic with bachelor PTs, master's PTs, and doctoral PTs. Everybody would be in the same. And as you looked around at each other, I don't think any one of us would say, well, I'm a better PT than you are, or you're a better PT than I am. You just had a different degree, right? And now, we're in a situation where there's probably there's probably still some, but there's probably very little bachelor PTs that are still practicing. And it's a mix of mostly doctoral PTs and some masters. My point in saying all that is we've got like 3 years of room to kind of play with, right? We went from 4 years all the way up to 7 years. And so surely there's some innovative opportunities to bridge that gap. I think about it from the perspective of, when we went from the master's degree to the DPT, if you really look at it at its most foundational level, you have to ask yourself, okay, Well, what else are PTs going to be learning in order to go from this master's degree to the DPT? At the end of the day, it was like diagnostic imaging, some primary care, medical screening, think all things that would prepare us for direct access, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most programs were 2 years in length, and higher ed, again, found a way to justify that amount of content deserves an entire another year of education. When in reality, I mean, if we're really honest with ourselves, could we have done that in 3 months? Could we have done it in 6 months? For sure, we could have done it in 6 months. And so, you know, I don't think we have to get rid of the DPT and go back to the masters. I don't think anyone thinks that's really the path we're going to take, but we can absolutely create these milestones along the way, like Larry alluded to, where, you know, we get a bachelor's degree, whether it's 3 years or 4 years. We go to a master's where we become licensed, and we have the opportunity then to complete our DPT on the backside. And so there's a lot of opportunity, but we do have to have a regulatory body and a professional association that will embrace that innovation. If we continue to just, you know, hit the nail with the hammer and say it's a, you know, 7-year DPT program, you know, we're never going to get there.
Right. So who decides this, or who needs to be the person that says this has to happen or else, right? There needs to be consequences. It's a nice thing to have, or it's a need to do. Who's in charge of that?
Yeah, so and I'll allude to this, but employers of PTs are severely underrepresented in this argument. We grouse, we complain, but we seldom have any voice or influence. And so we have to have employers banding together and locking arms with our academics and our higher education, with our regulators around this. You know, there's this other interesting phenomena that sort of happened, I refer to as the post-COVID hangover. And that is the reality that during the COVID time period, things were incredibly relaxed regulation-wise, which allowed people to do remote learning. We were deemed heretics by our own profession for trying to do a 2-year hybrid PT program. And we had decent number of years, even prior to COVID launching. COVID launched, our phones were ringing off the hook of people, how do we do this? Because we suddenly had academics, particularly in our own profession, said, never, ever, ever over my dead body will I teach online. Now calling and saying, how do I teach instructional design? How do I learn and do things online? All good. Things have changed. There are a lot more programs. That's a step in the right direction, but it hasn't cured anything. And the reality is, as an employer, I can tell you that PTs are coming out with less reps. They're coming out with less clinical confidence and less clinical readiness. That's not an old fogey saying, you know, they're not as good as they were when we were there. That is well documented amongst the employer group. So what do we have to do? We have to even put more resources into the training of new PTs that have suddenly paid for 6 or 7 years of school and aren't clinically ready. Now, this just isn't a PT phenomenon. I work in dentistry now. It's the same thing there. It's the same thing in primary care. It's the same thing across, because the regs relaxed enough, were enough reps, enough clinical experience. So we do have to go back to a more lengthier, you know, time period on the clinical side and regain that. Is it a less quality student? I don't know. I'm not willing to go there necessarily, other than the failure rates seem to suggest a correlation there. But I want to get a better clinical education, which we've collectively, us three have referred to as the big black hole, and we have some strong opinions about how to correct that. But I'll let Tim comment on the regulatory side, how we can, you know, figure out a way amongst the key stakeholders to get this thing turned.
Well, thanks for that, Larry. I think part of it. It's
well, as the most current practicing academic, I thought you might have some ideas on how we can do that. Maybe not.
Well, I was always offended when I was called, and I still am called an academician. And I mean, I just have always felt that I'm a clinician, and I never fit in the world of academia, because it's an area where, and again, I have wonderful colleagues in academia, but the difference between sitting around a table for an hour and a half and discussing things and debating things that just, you can't do that when you're actually trying to make payroll. I mean, it just doesn't happen.
Sure.
And the unfortunately, you think about, academia being liberal thinking and out there, new ideas, and I would argue it is not. It is very much rooted in, tradition and the threats of, doing something different. And that's just, so I don't think, unfortunately, universities are where we're going to look to see change happen.
Right.
And when it comes to regulatory bodies, that's again, rigid, hard to push through, hard to do anything innovative. I really think the change happens, unfortunately, through a crisis, is what we're seeing, as we see, this huge demand for our services, but not able to create a product out there that can meet that demand. So I'm more hopeful that our business leaders and our actually work areas will be able to change and partner with higher ed in a way that other businesses have, to say, this is what we need, and
Right.
we're willing to come and partner with you to create this. If we know that you're going to feed us a quality person to work in our field. So that, I guess my sense is, it's going to be hard. But the second thing is, with this quote unquote educational cliff, I think the bachelor's thing isn't going to be that difficult, because there's so fewer students that everybody's competing for on the bachelor's level, that those that are innovative there, I think, will be able to scale up and have larger programs, especially if they really focus, like some of these private, dare I say, for-profit institutions that are actually responsive to a bottom line, to say, hey, we can scale up and get more people through a bachelor's program in 3 years and feed into all these different healthcare programs, that we all need kind of a similar skill set. I think whoever does that, and maybe some people are, but it's definitely not common, whoever does that quickly, I think, can rapidly fill seats and be able to help that side of the workforce and roll them into DPT. So that was a long-winded answer to say I'm not real hopeful that I can see disruption happening anytime soon. But maybe, I'm curious what Larry's thoughts are, actually, because you always have those 10. Oh, go ahead, John.
Well, no, I was going to say, I'll just add one anecdote that sort of touches on sort of the resistance in higher ed and amongst, accrediting bodies. And in our case, that's CAPTI. I mean, this is 10 years ago, but I will never forget the moment that, we sat across the site visitors. This was the very first hybrid 2-year DPT program at South College. Mm-hmm. This was probably, I don't know if it was 2013, something around that time frame. Yep. And this was the hybrid model, right? Where, all the didactics were going to be done online, synchronously, asynchronously. And then when they came onto the campus, it was going to be 8-9 hours a day on your feet, getting all those reps in, right? This idea that psychomotor practice over and over and over, over a 7 to 10 day period, maybe those skills could be retained in a more effective way than this sort of lecture lab model that's very inefficient in a lot of traditional programs. And I will never forget when one of the site visitors looked across from me with this sort of blank stare and said, "But John, by having them in labs all day long, you're going to exhaust these students." And I'm sitting there, and I'll never forget my reaction. I had a really hard time not almost lashing out. I mean, I wanted to be like, that's exactly what we do as clinicians. We stand on our feet, going from patient to patient. I mean, it's a marathon in the day of the life of a clinician. And so my point is that you have these sort of incumbents, dare I say, gray hairs that have not been in practice for many years, who've completely lost perspective with what a clinician does every day. And so, we have to get the perspective of clinicians. To Larry's point, employers have to band together. Without employers, we don't have clinical sites. Employers have far more potential influence than I think we've realized as employers. So I think employers are a bright spot. Nursing, again, we've talked about nursing. They have so many different pathways. In part, that's because they have so many different accreditors. And so those different accreditors have sort of different flavors of kind of risk appetite for innovation. And it depends on the state you're in. I personally think we should have more than one accreditor. Right now we have one in CAPTI. The problem is individuals have looked at starting other accrediting bodies, but I'll forget how many states it is, but let's call it 20 to 30, it might even be 40 states. CAPTI is specifically named in the Practice Act as you have to graduate from a CAPTI accredited program, not just an accredited program, right? And so in order to compete, so to speak, with CAPTI, you'd have to literally change Practice Acts in all these states, which would take 50 years to do, and it may never happen. So, at the end of the day, we need more competition, and we need more willingness to accept really innovative practice models or educational models.
What happens if it doesn't change?
And we need more. Well, part of the unintended consequence of all this is, physical therapy tuition in the higher ed level, I'll start there, has been unabated relative to their increases in cost and tuition factors. And so as that has exceeded inflation for so many years, it's finally starting to have, some counterbalance in it because of some other disruption that's going on. I'm not talking about PT, I'm talking about higher ed in general. But the reality is, who would go into the profession for the ROI that you get at this particular stage? That is our selfish motivation for wanting to correct this. We want our best and brightest to go into it. There is absolutely, in fact, the way you can tell the ROI is so bad is only about 20 to, on an FTE basis, only north of 20% of all licensed PTs practice PT, okay, on a full-time basis. What other profession can you name in healthcare that has that obstacle? What other profession, period, healthcare or unrelated to healthcare, can honestly say we've had less productivity today than we had 10 and 15 and 20 years ago? I don't know of any other occupation in America that can say that, but PT we have. So the issue is we are overregulated, and unless you get a combination of decreased regulations and or enhancement of reimbursement, certainly don't see that coming, you're going to have a degree that has priced itself out of competition for the souls and the minds of young people. I think the other issue is you have to get, the problem is the states are relatively the easy ones. They basically say to get a license, you have to graduate from an accredited program. I think we can get the ones that say CAPTI reverse with probably opening up that Practice Act, but it's an obstacle, but they're the easiest. The more difficult one is CAPTI. And CAPTI is intertwined, co-located, and housed by APTA and needs to respond to its constituents, which are PTs and employers and academicians. And, we failed the first two times to try to get a hybrid PT program. We failed at it because it was unacceptable in the view of the accreditors. I don't know if that's public knowledge. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say that, John, but it's absolutely, because they could not handle that type of innovation. Now you've got highbrow universities doing 2-year hybrid programs, okay? And we have to go down that same route, unfortunately. But what we can't do, we thought within a few years of the first hybrid program that there would be imitators. It didn't take till post-COVID until 2022, 2023, these other programs came out. Meanwhile, we've got, 15 or 17 of these, and now it's becoming more and more normalized. That's a good thing, but it's not enough. We need multiple pathways, but we got to get the accreditors in a room with employers and academicians. And like I said, the states are the easiest ones, I think, to overcome. And then you've got to get, you got to get some pioneers out there. And it's probably going to come from the for-profits because they tend to be the most innovative and flexible. You cannot name great innovation with the exception of maybe Arizona State, not on the PT side, just talking generally. There are not a lot of high innovators on the public side. The private side are even fewer. And so it's the for-profits that got to say, we'll do a bachelor completer program in 3 years and get you ready for a PT program that you can do a 3+2 model. I think there's a pathway there and there's an opportunity, but it's going to take probably a younger set than Tim, John, I, and Rob Weiner to get it done this time. Maybe not.
Follow along in the series as these guys keep writing about it. I'll share a link in the show notes. Do want to say thanks to Empower EMR for supporting the show. If your clinic is stuck on an EMR that slows you down, you have to innovate. Empower gives you speed, clean workflows, and features PTs actually ask for: better notes, faster documentation, smooth operations, all wrapped in customer support that doesn't ghost you. EmpowerEMR.com, EmpowerEMR.com. If we don't change the timeline, if nothing changes, what does 2030 look like? If Marty can't lose, right? There's no tension in the story. People won't pay attention. I mean, I'm guessing if there isn't some consequence on the line, which we can see very clearly, even someone like me who's an amateur at this can see there's consequence. If we don't change the timeline, what does 2030 look like for the profession? And then we'll do parting shots. Looking at you, Tim.
Okay, well, I guess if nothing changes, we'll continue to see fewer seats filled in DPT education. The type of applicant that we'll get, probably, and no shade here, it'll be people that love it, the profession, but probably have a trust fund or something else that allows them to go through higher ed without debt. But also probably would rather work part-time, on the outside of it. We'll
Sure.
continue to see people doing it as more of a hobby, if you will. Again, more and more people working less full-time, doing other things and having side gigs in the profession. And what fills the gap? Then it's just every other flavor of body worker will fill the gap out there, and the health of our society, I firmly believe, will go down. As a physical therapist and that sees over and over the failure of our system, it's going to get a lot worse in terms of healthcare outcomes in our society.
All right, Larry, John, anything he missed there? It's going to get harder as we go along because he's covered a lot of bases. Anything you'd want to add to that?
I'll just sort of, I think, amplify what Tim said. We'll see less diversity in PT. Yep. It'll be largely Caucasian, affluent, passionate, people that maybe had a real positive experience in PT and debt to income sort of ratios. They don't even think about what that means for them because they have no debt. I think we'll see, certainly a contraction in the number of PT programs. There's just no way these smaller under-resourced programs will be able to, I think, survive in that scenario. So, I'm always a glass half full. I think the crisis is in front of us, like literally as we speak. So I'm hopeful we can, really. Hopefully eyes are opened, even amongst the those that have been most resistant to change and realize, without significant reform, our profession is in some amount of peril.
Yeah. All right, Larry, no pressure, but 2030, nothing happens. How bad is it?
Yeah, well, 2030, I expect if you think there's 20 to 30,000 shortage of PTs now, that'll increase 5 to 7,000 per year. Notwithstanding, because you have less graduates that actually practice clinical PT than ever. We will have less clinicians per year than we had prior to 2001, which is actually quite scary given the demand for PT. But the unfortunate thing is that PT will continue to be highly undifferentiated. Digital front doors and digital exercise will be conflated with PT, as will at-home remote therapeutic monitoring and YouTube. And so there'll be this bifurcation. If you got money and you're young and you're healthy, you'll be able to access PT. But if you're sick and you're elderly, your access points for PT, my goodness, if you're in a long-term care setting or a home health setting, even an acute care setting, certainly neuro rehab, you're going to have a hard time accessing hands-on PTs. And pediatrics is probably on that list as well. So the specialties will really be bludgeoned in terms of numbers. Those who are getting PT that are more into longevity and health and fitness and wellness, or generally musculoskeletal, they'll fake their way into a conflated PT that'll be a combination of digital front door and YouTube.
Yep. All right. Last thing we do on the show is called the parting shot.
This is the parting shot. One last mic drop moment. No pressure, just your legacy on the line.
Pressure there. Today's episode brought to you by U.S. Physical Therapy, a national network of clinics focused on developing clinicians, not burning them out. Leadership tracks, mentorship, and career growth, as long as we have a profession, and the stability to build your future in PT. If you want a place that supports how you want to practice, that's USPH, USPH.com. That's USPH.com. Tim, you've done this before with me a bunch of times. You get to lead off. So what's your parting shot? Final thoughts, soapbox statement, what do you got?
Okay, well, I still love this profession, and I still feel like from a societal perspective, we have so much to offer. And despite the gloom and doom said today, I still believe the future is bright, and we just need to accept what's in front of us. And just like, we have rehabilitated people, we can rehabilitate our system. And so I'll leave it with that. It's time for some serious, deep rehabilitation.
Love it. John, what do you got for your parting shot today?
Yeah, I think I would just end with a little bit of, optimism. There are some, when I look at all the engagement on, the initial post that both Larry and Tim did, there's some really well-informed, smart, younger entrepreneurs in our profession that are probably hell-bent and have ideas we haven't even thought about in making change. And, that's where we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I'm very optimistic that those individuals are not going to take no for an answer. And they're going to couple themselves with some mentors, whether it be us or many of the other, leaders in the profession that have done, contributed to some significant reforms. And so, hopefully that energy and youthfulness, will thrive in a way where, we'll see progress, perhaps in a way that us gray hairs ourselves, may not even be able to see ourselves. So, so to any of those young entrepreneurs in PT, whether you're an academician, a clinician, dare to dream and don't take no for an answer.
All right, Larry, no pressure. You got to wrap this up.
Well, while I share in my friends, colleagues, and partners' empowerment message that we do, in fact, have the ability to course correct here, I am also bothered by a serious data point. How many, if you just look at Tim and I, our kids are all older. John, your kids may still be in a way that they can, but how many will become physical therapists?
Right.
And the reality is that most PTs, when interviewed, do you want this career for your children? Absolutely, unequivocally say no. The same thing happens for physicians as well. And so my parting shot would be a question. If the answer to your question is, do I want my children to become a physical therapist? If that answer is no, what action, what activities, and what do we need to do, and what are you willing to do and help so that you can answer that question in the affirmative?
Wow. Yeah. Bold questions. We'll put the link to the series of articles that are going to be dropping throughout the next couple of weeks. Thanks for the insight, guys. We appreciate it. And thanks for setting a little optimism, then also putting some tension in the story, because no pressure, no diamonds.
That's it for this one, but we're just getting warmed up. Smash follow, send it to a friend, or crank up the next episode. Want to go deeper? Hit us at ptpintcast.com or find us on YouTube and socials at ptpintcast. And legally, none of this was advice. It's for entertainment purposes only. See, Keith, we read the script. Happy now?